Lunchtime Lecture Series, where throughout the summer we've been hearing from all different kinds of people on a variety of really wonderful topics. And this afternoon, we're with Herb Anderson, who's going to be talking with us about empathy. So I'm going to turn it over to Herb, let him introduce himself and facilitate our conversation. I'm going to share my screen so that some slides that he's using come up. Welcome to the lecture series, Herb.
All right, thank you, and thanks to all of you for coming. I see some names that I know that are not a part of the chapel. I'm, what can I say about myself? I'm a retired professor of pastoral care. I taught pastoral care 58 times, I think, if I'm counting correctly, in theological seminaries starting in 1969 and concluding at PLTS, Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary, when Phyllis was the president there. And when she retired, we moved to Sonoma, where we live now, and love it. And I think that's enough to say. I'm delighted to have one of our two children on this Zoom. The topic is so important. I have taught courses on it. I almost pulled down a bear when I left Catholic Theological Union after 15 years. The students gave me a big stuffed bear with a t-shirt on, and the t-shirt reads, "It's still empathy." So it's something that's been close to my heart for a very long time, and now it is very much in our political language as well. And so put up on the screen the quote from former President Obama: "Biggest deficit that we have in our society and in our world right now is an empathy deficit. We are in great need of people being able to stand in somebody else's shoes and see the world through their eyes." I would like to take a little moment and invite any of you who are inclined to say how you see that in your life and in your experience. Let's bracket out President Trump for this conversation, but how do you experience empathy deficit in what you see in the world, what you experience? Let's take a few minutes to just chat about that, and then we'll get on to talking about empathy. How do you see it? Where does it happen? Where do you read about it? Where do you feel it? Okay.
Yeah. We've just come back from walking on our local trail, and a number of people have sailed past us without face masks on. And I see that as a lack of empathy on their behalf.
Right, exactly. Okay. Well, I hope that there will, as time goes on, I hope that there will be plenty of opportunity for conversation. So the next slide, the question is what is empathy? And it is defined in a variety of ways, but I think overall we can say it recognizes the world of the other, it listens carefully and accurately to that world. It imagines that world as the other understands it, and then is able to communicate that understanding to the other. We'll come back and talk about that later. That last point, which is really sort of like the proof of the pudding, is in being able to communicate to somebody in such a way that they know they feel understood. Otherwise, it doesn't quite work as empathy. Next one, please. So, and I think we need to, it is both a cognitive thing and an affective thing. The complexity that often we face, and in the current climate of division among us in our people, in our families. I have a brother who only listens to the world according to Rush Limbaugh. it's complicated for us to talk with one another because the worlds are so far apart. Um, so there's truly a cognitive dimension, but there's also the affective dimension. There's also the sense of feeling our way into another person's world, to see through the eyes of another, to listen through the ears of another, to feel with the heart of another. Next. So to talk about what empathy is, it's probably also important to say what this slide should read, or could read, what empathy is not. And I think the biggest confusion is that we often confuse empathy and sympathy, or we substitute sympathy for empathy. Sympathy is what is felt for the other. It's the response to another's sadness or plight or story, and it's what is evoked in me, in my response. So we often do that when it's often the first thing that we do when we hear somebody's story of sadness, death, tragedy, loss of some kind, and we'll say, "I'm sorry to hear." And so we begin with my feeling about your experience. And I don't mean to say sympathy is not important, but it is often and best understood as maybe the place where we start, but move beyond that. And sympathy may sometimes become pity. It may also be communicated in a very compassionate way. But sympathy cards are what we send. I'll say later on, I think our best cards when some person has a loss or a death in a family are empathy cards, which begin with a blank, with a blank paper. Empathy also sometimes is confused with identification. We will say, "I know what you're going through." Somebody's mother dies. It's easy for us to say, "Well, I lost my mother a year ago," and so we assume that there's some kind of identification between our experience and the other's experience because we have had a similar loss. And we forget that my relationship to my mother is probably not the same as this person's relationship to his or her mother. And so identification, some say you can't have empathy without some identification. I think that's about limiting our imagination, but it is true that we do look for touch points. We look for points of connection. And even when we are meeting people for the first time. But we may come back to this a little later. We can have some more conversation about sympathy and identification as sometimes confusing. Why is empathy necessary? Validates our uniqueness. It diminishes isolation. I don't think we can emphasize enough how important it is to have conversations with people that diminish their sense of isolation or loneliness. I often would say in teaching pastoral care that we have no idea how many people open every envelope that's addressed to the occupant because it's the only mail they get. And it's form letter, it's form stuff, it's trying to talk them into buying something they shouldn't buy, but it comes to them in isolation. And I think that we could talk about empathy epidemic or deficit. We can also talk about a loneliness epidemic in our society, increasing and of course intensified by the pandemic and our being sequestered. I think that maybe the most important thing about empathy is that it works towards transforming our ethnocentric thinking. That is, if the assumption is that if the world is my world, or my world is the world, that I see the world through my own eyes, and that's the world as it should be or is, the only world that is. And if any of you watch MSNBC and then flip over to Fox News, you know that you are in two different worlds. And I think for many of us, the capacity to see the world as another person sees it, however different it may be and however wrong we may believe it to be, it does help us to not see the world only through our own eyes. And then just another word about grief and consolation. I really want to say as strongly as I can that it's empathy that finally is what consoles. Sympathy helps, identification may go for a while, but most of all, when we are grieving, we want somebody to understand our grief from our perspective, from how we are experiencing it. And that is, there's more that we could say about that, but I think we'll press on to the next. So the question is it possible at all? Some people say no, some people say yes. Empathy is at least a never-ending process of overcoming partial views. So yes, it is. It is possible. Is it totally possible? Probably not. Will we ever fully understand ourselves because we are mysteries to ourselves? Probably not. Will we ever understand another who is a mystery to us and to themselves? Probably not. But I do believe that it is important for us to act as if empathy were possible. That is, even if it's not possible, we still live as if it were. Even if it's limited, I believe that our intention to understand another human being can convey compassion and understanding that diminishes their sense of isolation. I think what makes, what we need to keep remembering in our efforts to understand another, hang on for just a second, back, that empathy is between knowing and not knowing, and all of life, I suppose, is that way. But it's a disposition of the soul that's important for us to be able to do. Now the next one. So if we believe it's possible, how, albeit limited, this is sort of the crux of what I want to communicate. So I want to stop and see if there's anybody who has a comment or question about anything I've said so far. This next slide represents sort of my my central pitch, that if we're going to promote empathy as we have been, what are the dispositions that make it possible? And so that's what we want to talk about. But is there any question about anything I've said so far, or comment from anybody?
Herb, Sharon Stockley here. When you talk about empathy, do you include empathy for ourselves?
Yes. Yeah.
Because I find that to be very important in my life. Because I
might, yes, I think so. I'll talk a little later about curiosity. Okay. And curiosity about ourselves, and I suppose empathy. I think those might be synonymous, but yes, I agree.
Herb?
Yes.
Herb? Hi. I just wanted to, and I wrote it down and underlined because it's something I've never heard, and it really woke me up. And it's great. Empathy is between knowing and not knowing. We think we should know how to do this. And it's a disposition of the soul, which kind of gives me some hope, because myself as an ego or as trying to do it right, could just get in my way, and certainly in the way of being a comfort to somebody else. So I'm looking forward to what else you have to say, because I think my soul can handle it.
Yeah, you're wonderful. Thank you. I couldn't have orchestrated a better segue to what we're going to talk about. And in a moment, I'm going to give a quote from Maya Angelou about courage, and it's precisely at the point where we feel like we have to do it right, and so if we don't, because we can't do it right, we don't do it at all. And so if we understand and I think if we are working with intent to understand another human being, they will recognize that in us, if we feel it in ourselves, that this is always with humility, always with a recognition of knowing and not knowing, always with a kind of honor of their mystery, always with a sense of that we are in, that it's a process of clarifying partial knowledge and partial understanding. So thank you very much. Let's press on. So what I want to talk about is what's the disposition of the soul? What are the attitudes? I like the term disposition of the soul, but it didn't fit on the screen as Bennett created this for me. And by the way, thank you very much again, Bennett. So 5 things that I think are essential. Wonder and awe in ordinary life. We need more wonder. We need more sense of we have an orchid. We had an orchid in our guest bathroom that I will often use on a day-by-day basis. And every time I walked into that bathroom, I was astonished by the one beauty of this orchid. Well, then somebody came to see us on their way to Oregon, and they dropped off, and that was dying, and they dropped off a new orchid, an even more spectacular one. And every time I go to do what needs to be done in bathrooms, I am struck with wonder and awe. But before we go on, I just want to read you from Martin Luther. Because the wonder is probably one of the most important dispositions. This is at the presentation of the Lord. So he's reflecting on Simeon's blessing of the baby Jesus in the temple. His wonders no reason can comprehend. Wonderful is it that in the midst of death is life, in the midst of folly there's wisdom. Let us then take heart. How wonderful that the child of a poor abandoned maid should become king of the world. Does not make sense. Wonder brings faith. If you don't remember anything I said today, you might remember that. Wonder brings faith. He who does not believe cannot understand, know, or see. He who understands cannot but wonder. There you have it. So wonder, and that's a disposition that we have towards the other as we begin the process of trying to understand someone who is very different than us. Secondly, respect for the other. That is a way of seeing that other person in their uniqueness, as different from me. I'm going to read you just a little bit from a novel by David Malouf. And Phyllis and I encountered this novel a long time ago because I was giving some lectures in Australia. And so I was reading novels written by Australians. And Malouf is an Australian writer and it's called Remembering Babylon. And the story is about somebody named Gemi who arrives, a shipwrecked person who's been raised by the Aboriginals. And although he's a British subject, I'm a British subject, eventually he says, he walked and talked and lived and acted as if he were an Aboriginal. So all of a sudden, this world is opened up for somebody named Jock McIver. And he sees himself more clearly. He sees his neighbors differently. And the tall grass he walked through all the time had tips beaded with green he had not seen before. He also sees his wife in a new way. This is what I would love. He had turned his full gaze upon her. That is what she felt. He wanted to know now what her life was beyond what he saw and had taken for granted. A shirt washed and shaken to make it soft, food on the table, to inquire into her affections. And now this line. It was amazing to him that is what his tentativeness suggested, that he had known so little and had not looked. That he had known so little and had not looked. So that's then to curiosity. And curiosity is I think, most represented by the wonderful phrase, I could say it in Latin, but it's from a philosopher of long ago. I am human, nothing human is alien to me. Now, I think to be curious about another human being requires a sense of being curious about ourselves, being able to imagine. We've talked enough, I think, about humility that I don't need to emphasize that again. But it is this knowing that we know nothing, that we know nothing, that empathy means acknowledging that there is a horizon of context that extends beyond what we can see. But what that means concretely for those of us who seek to understand the world of another is that we can never assume that we have their whole story, that what we know of another person or culture is always an approximation. Empathy may be good enough, even if it's proximate, partial, and penultimate. And finally, the willingness to change. I think empathy is dangerous. And I think it's dangerous because if we truly understand another human being, if we truly honor another human being, hear their story, imagine their story in its fullness, it is very likely that we will be changed. Many centuries ago, a Roman Catholic a woman religious who died very young, wrote something called the Evangelist's Gamble that applies here. She says, evangelism is a martyria. That what that means is that that does not mean primarily the risking of possessions or life, but rather that the evangelist gambles, as it were, with his or her own understanding of belief in the course of evangelizing. He has no guarantee that his own understanding of faith will not emerge unaltered by the dialogue. So if we engage in conversation with another human being, to understand that human being, to care for that human being, to have conversation and build friendship with that human being, we will be changed. That's inevitable. We will at least be changed because our view of the world will be expanded because we have known them. Next slide, please. And so empathy is a disposition. It is a disposition of the soul, I'm wanting to say, openness of mind and heart, a courage to bear surprise. And then I'll read this quote, and I'm so very glad that my daughter Joy is going to be able to hear me read this, because when she and her husband were married, they created this booklet for their wedding. You know how you go to a wedding and you want to get there early because you want to have a good seat and you sit and you have nothing to do. It's really tacky to read a novel. Well, they had put together this booklet of many, of like 16, 24 pages. I don't know, we stapled them all together before the wedding. And her husband and they had written their stories together. They had done that, and then they had found wonderful quotes, mostly of Gilbert's work. And this quote is by Rainer Maria Rilke, and it describes for me both the disposition and the outcome of empathy. Once the realization is accepted, he said, that even between the closest human beings, infinite distances continue to exist. Between the closest human beings, infinite distances continue to exist. And a wonderful living side by side can grow up if they succeed in loving the distance between them, which makes it possible for each to see the other whole and against a wide sky. For each to see the other whole and against the wide sky. That's from Love and Other Difficulties. It's one of my favorite quotes, and thank you very much, Joy. All right. Let's take a moment to talk about dispositions, because now we're having talked about dispositions, 5 of them. I want to talk about the process of empathy and what goes into it. So let's take a moment for comments or questions or observations or sharing. Am I making am I being
no,
clear?
so if you want, Louise, unmute yourself and
Well, I've been thinking about something I heard on NPR through this. It was 2 sisters, one of whom was liberal progressive and the other of whom was very conservative. And the liberal sister was very upset at her conservative sister about voting against social welfare programs, increased taxes to pay for them, and so on. And the conservative sister, so, you know, how can you be so heartless? And the conservative sister said, why aren't you taking care of people? Why aren't you feeding them? And that's always struck me, because it was such a different take on the responsibility
right.
for what you see.
Yep. And what
I
we
saw Judy Spiegel's hand.
it is
Sorry,
those differences are pervasive. Anybody else?
Judy.
Yeah, Judy Spiegel. I'm interested in the difference between empathy and sympathy.
Okay.
Yeah, that's an interesting distinction.
Well, did what I say, we can go back to that for a moment. What I said, what I tried to say was that sympathy is really about my feeling.
I see. Okay. Yeah.
I was, and it starts with me, and it's not inappropriate. It's just not sufficient. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not, and we often stop there. Because it's an easier thing to do. We'll come back to the question again in a moment about courage, because it risks very little. When I say I'm sorry to hear, you know, we're not taking the moment to enter into a world that somebody else is experiencing, even if we know very little about it. And to say, tell me, just to invite them to say something about the loss, the person that they lost, or the experience that they lost, or the job they lost, or whatever it was that they were, to invite them to tell you about what this is about, rather than assuming that you know because you've had some similar experience. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay. All right, let's go on to the book.
Oh, wait, I have a quick a question, or not question, just comment. I love this idea of the infinite distance, right, between us and other people, and how you know, I fall often into the trap of if you've known somebody for a long time, you think you know everything about them.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And there remains an infinite distance between you and them. And I loved your quote from the reading, what her life was beyond what he saw. Right. That is still true for my parents who've been together for over 65 years, right? That there still is this mysterious distance between them that evokes incredible curiosity for one another and their experience of the world. So thank you for bringing that up.
Can I just ask a quick question? That I just wanted to build on that comment, Jeff, because I think one of the things that I've thought a lot about.
My daughter speaking. Thank you very much.
What I've thought a lot about, and we've had many conversations about this, Dad, but I think there's a way in which empathy gets framed as wanting to understand the other. And I think similar to sympathy, when you really, really want to understand the other person, then it becomes about your need to understand versus what's important to them. And the sort of difference between I need to understand how you feel because then it'll make sense to me versus a generosity, humility in saying, I may not understand it, but I know that it's important to you. And in that is where the connection is, because I recognize that I don't need to understand it to know that it's important to you.
Wonderful.
Yeah, she's a very wise woman, this daughter. She's a daughter of my mostly.
She must have had good parents.
Yeah, well, I give credit to Phyllis. Joy, that's so, I mean, when I hear you say that, I know it to be true in my life, and you know it to be true in my life. And I think it is a common thing for all of us. It's now the segue. It's the perfect segue to the first thing that we have to do to its disposition. And now the next thing is it's both a disposition and a moment or action. And the first step in the moment or action is self-emptying and setting aside. And that includes, I think I'm following what you were saying, Joy, that includes setting aside my need to be the understanding one, my need to be the one who understands, and that it is as a self-emptying, setting aside. In a little moment, we're going to come back and do a theological take on this, because it's about the kenosis, that our Lord did not count equality with God something to hold on to, but emptied himself, setting aside himself. So in this time of decluttering, this is internal decluttering. And I don't know if I've had time to tell my favorite story of this in my own life was when I was a pastor a long time ago in Sacramento, California. And I had just gone to visit two people, Checo and Larry, and Checo was Japanese and met when he was in the Korean War and Vietnam War, sorry, and on TDY, and he met her and they were married, and they had wanted to have children and were not able to have children, and so they had adopted a Chinese American girl. Now think the radical cultural moment of this American and this Japanese woman adopting a Chinese, she was not Chinese American, adopting a Chinese girl. I went from there and that wonderful celebration to the hospital to see somebody who had just given birth to her fourth child. And she already had 3 daughters, and alas, came a 4th daughter. And she was so mad at God. She was so pissed at God. I told God if I was going to have another child, it better be a boy. And this child was never baptized. Shortly after her husband, who had been the best scoutmaster you could ever find because he had 3 daughters, and that makes good scoutmasters, could not do it anymore. I never could set aside the celebration with Checo and Larry to fully apprehend the pain and the anguish of this woman who wanted a boy and got another girl. Self-emptying and setting aside is so important, and it's so hard to do, but if we think about it as internal decluttering, I hope it will help. Then secondly, it's about listening intently and listening more. I think that the hardest, the the most important thing that we can ever understand if we want to be caring of one another is to keep asking the question, how much can I hear, rather than what will I say? People who have said to me, you know, I wanted to go to the hospital and see my friend who was sick, but I didn't know what to say, and so I didn't go. Think about times in your life when you have thought maybe you were going to call somebody on the who had just had maybe a joy, maybe a sadness of some kind, and you stopped because you didn't know what to say. The question is, how much can we hear? And there was a Episcopal priest named Urban Holmes who wrote a book in which he talked about the centrality of receptivity as the human mode of being. So how much can I hear? That's second. Third, of course, even if we listen carefully, even if we listen very, very carefully, we need to imagine a world different than our own. And that does take imagination. It does, and curiosity helps, but I think some capacity to imagine. And I hope that the world in which we're growing up with television and videos that will give us a visual to go with the song that we're hearing, will still have enough imagination that we can foster. Reading novels is important, as my daughter could attest to, and probably also Phyllis. I was often in airports watching people and trying to imagine a story that was unfolding as this family was gathering some distance over in the airport waiting room back in the day when you could watch. But to imagine is an important thing. I think fourthly, to be able to suspend judgment while we are listening. That's a very, if you're on the Myers-Briggs scale with a J, that's often a it's hard not to make a judgment about what you're hearing, but rather to set aside our impulse to judge. Empathy presumes the ability to hold in tension differing and even contradictory worldviews without judgment. And in order to make room for compassion, we need to suspend judgment. There is, then the final one, it kind of brings us back to the issue of identification. That there's a sufficient mutuality. When we're meeting somebody for the first time, we're always looking for points of contact. That's an important thing. But there needs to have we need to have some sense of mutuality for this person that is built as we listen and we find some points of contact. I did clinical pastoral education as part of my seminary. As part of my seminary training, I did clinical pastoral education at Rikers Island Penitentiary in the East River, shortly after the assassination of Malcolm X. I was a boy who grew up in Scandia, Minnesota. There were 95 people, and they were all Swedish, and they were all Republicans, and they drove General Motors cars, and it was a very safe world. And to be in the world of junkies and addicts and homicide people, and in this world was a radical shift. But as I listened to their story, I could find the points of contact. We all share moments of fear or of terror. My fear may not have been quite the same as growing up in New York City, in a violent kind of neighborhood. But my fear when I went down to the basement in our house in Scandia, Minnesota, to get something out of the fruit cellar, and I had to close the door, and it was dark behind me, and it was dark behind me. I don't know if anybody has ever had that little fear of the dark behind you. So we find points of mutuality, and so these are the movements: self-emptying, and then listening, and then imagining without judgment, and looking for mutuality. And let's go to the next. So comes to now responding. And because for empathy to occur, there's listening, and there's listening, and there's listening, and then there's responding with words as well as affect. We can be good listeners, but not empathic responders. And here's that quote from Maya Angelou, which I just came upon, and I love it. I think we all have empathy. Well, it may be true. I think we all have empathy. We may not have enough courage to show it. And I don't remember the name of the person who introduced this topic, but thank you so much, because it is true. It's risky for us to say, I hadn't thought about what you're saying about your situation, and how fearful it was for you to be in that moment, or how hard it was for you to listen to your mother all those days when she was not in her best way, or how hard it was, whatever you're doing in however stumbling ways it may be of being empathic. We're going to stumble in being empathic, but to do it, it takes a little courage. Our responses need to reflect as accurately as we can what we've heard of the other, but it takes courage to do that. All right, let's stop for a moment, and I have to acknowledge that we now have our whole family on board. This is really quite a remarkable thing, and you'll see in the very far corner, at least I'm saying hello, Joel. Oh, there he is now. He's just above Robin Gee, and just underneath his sister, and he's coming to us from Leiden, the Netherlands. So wonderful to see you, Joel. So the 5 steps, setting aside, listening carefully, imagining, and then the courage to respond. Any comments before we do a little theological interlude? Yep, from Houston.
Herb, I'm sure you remember this. When the old LCA was debating whether to divest from South Africa.
Oh, yeah.
The arguments raged on, and we white people, we knew so much. And then when we finally decided to divest, the treasurer of the church at the time was the treasurer of Mobil Oil. And his point was, I'm an executive with a large American oil company, and I know so much better than the black people do. And we're doing so much more that if we go along with this divestiture, I'm going to have to resign. We voted to divest, and he resigned.
Yeah.
What he did not do was listen to the victims.
Yeah.
The victims were screaming at us. Please divest. Churches, worldwide churches. The only thing you're doing by staying invested in this hole is allowing the system to go on. That cemented for me forever a lack of empathy.
Yeah.
The notion that we white people know more. When it came time to vote for which Democrat we wanted, to me it was a no-brainer. I said, who do the black people want?
Yeah.
They wanted Biden, I'm for Biden. If they wanted somebody else, I'd be for, I didn't care. I just went, I followed the black people.
Anybody else? Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else speaking to the does it make it easier to think about empathy? Does it make it harder to think about empathy I hope it makes it easier to think about it. It's something we can do. It's not easy to do, but it can be done.
Herb, I have a comment.
Oh, excuse me.
Yep.
David, go.
Oh, yeah, okay. Rod Seeger gave me as a gift of a number of conversations, and I think of one of his proverbs. You mentioned Jay on the Myers-Briggs. I think I'm an introvert, and one time Rod said to me, introverts keep the best feelings to themselves. And I wonder, I know, you know, I'm Texan, that fits. I wonder if it fits Norwegians and Swedes. In other words, you know, somehow to get beyond our own psychological profile, you know, and actually say something that's sympathetic to someone.
Yeah.
But somehow a number of his proverbs stick in my mind, and that's one of them. I've tried very hard, you know, to say what I'm feeling to a person from her.
Well, I think that is so nice to hear your voice and nice to see you, David. I think that the easiness of, I mean, I often would hear from students over the years that they were very good listeners. And I would say, that's wonderful. But how will the people know that you're a good listener if you don't tell them what you've heard? And that's where the courage comes. That's the movement that makes it possible, however risky it is, to begin a journey together, to understand one another or to help one another be understood. But it's risky. All right, we're going to run out of.
Could I jump in on that? Just
sure.
The point, because one of the things that's really struck me as I hear you, and I've heard it before, but it's always new, talking about empathy is, or I'll put it as a question. Could you maybe say something more about how you see the challenge of trying to understand the other and how it relates to empathy? Because as I heard you talking, I thought one of the things that was really powerful is the way in which the desire to kind of make sense of the other and have them fit into your categories, and the desire in that sense to understand the other is really at odds with genuine empathy. Right? So there's a kind, I think that maybe that there's the part of the courage that's needed is to let go of the expectation that you're going to easily be able to make sense.
Yeah, I think you joined us a little.
No, I was there from the beginning. I
think what you're pointing to is precisely, it's not unlike the point made by your sister. And it is also this sense of, I think that the two, if I were to say one of the two dominant emotions that are necessary for good empathy, humility and courage would be the two. And humility is about always knowing that what we understand is partial, and that it finally is more important that the person with whom I'm having the conversation comes to new understanding about himself or herself than my understanding. But I think mystery, yeah, I don't know, I'm not sure that's a response. We'll carry the conversation on later, right? All right.
So Judy Spiegel had one. I think she had a question.
Yeah.
Then we can move.
Well, I've kind of forgotten, but I really appreciate the distinction between how you elaborated on the distinction between sympathy and empathy, and it does have to do with where the emphasis is.
Right.
Is it on you or is it on me?
Yeah, on the other person. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Okay, let's go to the next one. So this is just to say that from a Christian point of view, I believe that empathy is in a way the way of Jesus. From birth to death, Jesus chose a life that was the embodiment of self-emptying. I lay down my life, no one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. So that the kenosis, or the self-emptying of Jesus, I believe becomes a norm for our life of faith and our practice of empathy. Next slide. And so also the ascension. Many years ago, and now I'm going to say probably 35 years ago, I preached a sermon about the Ascension, which is one of my favorite festivals of the church year, but we don't do it often. And I want to say that the Ascension, that is the return of Jesus to the presence of God, the return of the resurrected Christ to the presence of God, however we want to think about it, is that God knows now in a way that God did not know before what it means to be human. And so the Ascension is about God's empathy. And so that we know that God knows in a way that God didn't know before what it is for us to be human. And so that our struggle to be human is with God, and that gives me courage to trust the comfort of God. I think it's so important that empathy comes before comfort. Empathy comes before seeking to give people assurance that it will be okay, but you need to understand and need to demonstrate that you understand where I am. Talk about that in a moment. Let's go to the last, because it's the final sort of point. I want to say that finally empathy needs to be transformed by compassion. Let's go ahead to the next one, just and then we'll come back to this. That empathy requires that we set aside everything that I'm not able to see. I can't see the slide. I got to move something here so I can. There, now I got it. That empathy requires that we set aside what is important so that we can hear and understand the story of another. But we are also invited to allow ourselves to be moved by the pain of the people and the stories that we hear. That's about compassion. And both of these are true, so that we are setting aside ourselves on the one hand, and then we are on the other hand allowing ourselves to be moved by the stories that people tell us. Go back to the last previous one, and then so that compassionate empathy is what transforms. Once I believe that my pain is on your heart, nothing will ever be the same. And I don't know how to say this it's hard to write and it's hard even to express, but it's possible for there to be accurate empathy. I once went to a psychoanalyst when I was in a bad time in Chicago, and everybody said, you got to go see Harry Trostman. He's an expert on empathy. And he sure was. He sat behind his desk with his white coat, and he was accurate in his description of my plight. I needed compassion at that moment in my life, as well as empathy. And I think that's finally what is transformative. That is when another human being knows, believes that the pain, the story, the struggle that they have shared with somebody has been held by that person, albeit briefly, and then returned to them. That pain is not the same because somebody else has held it. Somebody else has heard it. Somebody else has believed what you have gone through. So I think in the final analysis, I'm a little unhappy with the way in which empathy and compassion are often talked about now in the political realm as though they were the same, and they are and they are not. When Jesus saw the crowd, he was moved in his bowels. That's what compassion is about. And people need to know that their story has moved us. And then we can, and then we give it back. We don't take it with us. So compassion and empathy finally is, I believe, what transforms. And I think that's all I have to say for this day. Well, thank you all for listening. We got time for we have a moment for more conversation. We used to go after 12 noon. If there's anybody who wishes to stay on, I'll be very happy to carry on. But does anybody have a comment or question before we stop? We got time for that?
We do. We do have time for comments and questions. We'll break at around noon, and then if anybody wants to stay around afterwards, we're welcome to do that as well. Any comments or questions? You're free to unmute yourselves. Raise your hand when you do it. Karen.
Well, I really related to how transformative it is when somebody, I would say it maybe that somebody feels my pain or knows my pain.
Yep.
When I lost my partner 5 years ago, the people who I could share that with were the people who loved him dearly, his older sister, his dearest friend. And in their presence, I felt healed. I felt known. I felt unburdened.
Yeah.
Unburdened. So it really, just wanted to share that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Other comments? All right. Let's thank Herb for this really wonderful exploration. And I felt like I was at the family dinner table and want to be invited when the Andersons get together for a reunion. Thank you so much. Very stimulating. I want to introduce next week's topic just so that everyone remembers this. It's going to be Robert Strand, who's a professor at the Haas School of Business. Robert and Sarah and their two boys, Jonas and Mikkel, are members at the chapel. Robert's is writing a book right now during the pandemic called Sustainable Vikings, and he's going to explore the topic of how Nordic countries rose from relative poverty to demonstrating the most sustainable and resilient societies in the world. And I hear that Nikolai Grundtvig is going to make an appearance in his presentation. So Happy Danes will be pleased, as well as other kind of Lutheran types who know anything about Grundtvig. But join us next Friday, same place, same time, to hear Professor Strand. Again, thanks for being a part of the lecture today. And anybody who wants to stay around afterwards to be in conversation with Herb is welcome to do so. But it's 1 o'clock and people have places to go. So thanks very much. It's great to see all of you here.